I thought we were just having one of those warm, ordinary Sunday dinners. The kind where the pasta is slightly overcooked, the wine is cheap but plentiful, and my daughter sits strapped into her high chair smearing marinara sauce across her cheeks like war paint, giggling at her own magnificent chaos. The kitchen smelled of garlic and basil and the particular, comforting fog of a family meal in progress, and I remember feeling genuinely happy that evening, a slow, unhurried happiness that settled into my bones like sunlight through old glass. I had been so tired in those first months after Emma was born, bone-tired, the kind that lives behind your eyes and turns every small sound into an ambush. But by 9 months, Daniel and I had found our rhythm, and for the first time since the positive pregnancy test turned my entire world sideways, I felt like I could breathe again. I had absolutely no idea that my mother-in-law, Carol, was waiting for exactly this moment, when I was relaxed, when my guard was down, when I felt safe and full and loved, to detonate the thing she had been planning for quite some time. What I would discover over the following days was not a thoughtless suggestion born from an awkward family dinner. It was a coordinated campaign, cold, deliberate, and my own husband had been quietly endorsing it for weeks while he kissed me good morning and told me I was doing a wonderful job as a mother. Carol arrived that evening carrying her signature hostess gift, a bottle of Pinot Noir she would inevitably drink most of herself, and a smile that always managed to look warm without ever quite reaching her eyes. She was a handsome woman in her mid-60s, the kind who wore silk blouses on a Sunday and called it casual, whose perfume arrived in the room a full 3 seconds before she did. A heavy, suffocating floral scent that I had spent 4 years of marriage trying to love and never managed. She cooed over Emma the way she always did, lifting her from the high chair with practiced ease, pressing a red lipstick kiss to my daughter's forehead that left a vivid, waxy smear. Daniel would quietly wipe it off later with a damp cloth, while I stood at the kitchen sink, pretending to rinse glasses and grinding my back teeth hard enough to ache. But that was a normal evening with Carol. I had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to categorize her various intrusions into tolerable and intolerable, and to conserve my energy strictly for the intolerable ones. Daniel was pouring wine when Carol settled herself on the sofa with Emma perched on her knee, bouncing her gently and producing the small musical noises that grandmothers seem to make instinctively, as if the knowledge is encoded somewhere deep and biological. He caught my eye over the rim of the bottle and gave me one of his looks, a compressed, faintly apologetic smile that said she's being perfectly fine tonight. Just relax. And I let myself be persuaded. I carried the bread basket to the coffee table and let the evening wash around me, easy and domestic, the way it was supposed to be. Emma fell asleep in Carol's arms around 8 o'clock, which was unusual. She had been a difficult, resistant sleeper since her first week of life, and the novelty of her grandmother's heavy perfume was apparently more effective than every sleep training method Daniel and I had attempted and abandoned in exhausted defeat. He carried her upstairs, careful on the stairs, one hand supporting the back of her head, and Carol and I were left alone in the living room together for the first time all evening. The quiet that settled between us felt comfortable enough that I wasn't bracing for anything. I had my wine, I had a magazine open in my lap that I wasn't really reading. The candles on the coffee table had burned down to soft, flickering stubs. Outside, a warm October wind moved through the oak tree in the front yard, and I could hear the leaves brushing against the window with a sound like whispering. And that is precisely when she said it. "I've been meaning to bring something up," Carol said, setting her wine glass down on the table with a small, deliberate click. Her voice had shifted. It had acquired that particular texture, smooth and unhurried and careful, that I had come to recognize over the years as the sound of a prepared speech. I looked up from the magazine. It's about Diane's visits. Diane was Carol's younger sister, 58 years old, quiet, gentle, and childless. She had tried for years to have a baby and could not, a fact that the entire family spoke about in the lowered, careful tones, typically reserved for a terminal diagnosis. I had always felt genuinely sorry for Diane in the way you feel sorry for someone you don't know well but recognize as good. A soft, honest pity that I had always tried to translate into small, specific kindnesses. I had avoided mentioning my pregnancy around her until it was impossible to ignore. I had steered conversations away from children when she was present. I had been thoughtful, or I had tried to be. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice light. "What about them?" Carol folded her hands in her lap, a gesture I would later identify as one of her tells, something she did when she was about to say something she had practiced. "Diane has been struggling," she said, her voice pitched low and sympathetic, the register of a woman sharing a confidence. "You know how much she loves coming here, loves being with the family, but since Emma was born, it's been difficult. Seeing the baby, all the reminders." She paused, a careful, calibrated pause, to let this settle. "Daniel and I have been talking. We wondered if it might be possible, on the days Diane visits, to perhaps keep Emma upstairs, or arrange for her to be with a sitter, just to give Diane some space to be with the family without the difficulty." I remember the exact quality of the silence that followed. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere on the street, a neighbor's dog barked once and went quiet. I sat with Carol's words arranged in front of me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to assemble, because assembling them meant understanding what she was actually asking. And understanding, that meant confronting something I wasn't ready for. "Daniel and I have been talking." Those 5 words, I turned them over slowly, the way you turn over a stone to check what lies underneath. My husband had been talking to his mother about this. My husband had been part of the construction of this proposal. My husband, who had stood at the foot of my hospital bed and cried, actually cried, the first time Emma laughed at a plastic toy shaped like a giraffe. "I'm sorry," I said, and my voice was remarkably steady, given what was happening inside my chest. A cold, spreading sensation, like something had cracked open beneath the ice. "You're asking me to keep my daughter out of her own living room when a specific visitor comes." Carol's expression did something complicated, a tightening at the corners of her mouth, a slight cooling in her eyes that she covered quickly with a performance of gentle patience. "Not keep her out, sweetheart. Just be considerate. You know how sensitive this situation is, after everything Diane has been through." "I do know," I said. I set down the magazine carefully, aligning its edge with the corner of the coffee table, a small, precise movement. "And I have always tried to be kind to Diane, but Emma lives here. She is 9 months old and she lives in this house, and I am not going to arrange her absence so that adults can have the comfort of pretending she doesn't exist." The warmth in Carol's voice acquired a brittle edge, subtle but unmistakable, like a hairline fracture in fine china. "No one is suggesting pretending anyone doesn't exist. We're asking for a small accommodation, a gesture of compassion toward a woman who has suffered enormously." She looked at me with an expression that managed to be simultaneously disappointed and aggrieved, the expression of a woman who had expected better. I had hoped you would approach this with more openness, more generosity of spirit. I am generous, I said, and I surprised myself with how level I sounded. But generosity has limits, and the limit is here. Carol picked up her wine glass. She regarded me over the rim for a long, appraising moment, the look of a woman recalibrating, reassessing the terrain. I had assumed, she said slowly, choosing each word with visible deliberateness, that Daniel had already spoken to you about this, that you'd be coming to this conversation having had some time to think it through and soften to the idea. He hasn't said a word to me about it, I said. This is the first I'm hearing of any of this. Something moved across Carol's face in that moment. Quick, almost invisible, there and then gone. Surprise or irritation, or the particular frustration of a plan that had not been executed properly by one of its participants. "Oh," she said. "I see. Well, I'm sure he was simply waiting for the right moment." I excused myself to the kitchen, where I stood over the sink with the cold water running over my hands, staring at the drain. The water was very cold. I was glad of it. I dried my hands on the dish towel and stood there in the quiet of my own kitchen. My kitchen. The kitchen I had chosen and furnished and spent 4 years making into something that felt like home. And I thought about those 5 words. Daniel and I have been talking. I thought about how many of those conversations there might have been. How many evenings Carol had called while I was bathing Emma or finishing a work presentation, and what had been said in those calls that I hadn't known about. I thought about the way Daniel had smiled at me over the wine bottle earlier, and I wondered if that smile had not been an apology for his mother's general behavior, but for something specific that he had known was coming. I went upstairs. I needed to see Emma. She was sleeping on her back in her crib, arms thrown out wide in that total, trusting abandon that babies sleep with, as if the concept of danger is not yet something their bodies understand. Her chest rose and fell with the slow, deep rhythm of complete unconsciousness. The streetlight coming through the curtains made a faint gold stripe across her face, across the dark curve of her lashes, across the small, soft fist she had pressed against her cheek. I stood over her in the dark for a long time, not touching her, just watching her breathe. She was so entirely and unambiguously herself, so real, so present, so completely without any quality that deserved concealment, that the proposal Carol had just made felt not merely wrong, but obscene. A violence done to something that had not earned violence and could not understand it. Daniel found me there 20 minutes later. I heard him on the stairs. The familiar creak of the 4th step, the pause outside the nursery door. Before he pushed it gently open, he came to stand beside me at the crib. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and it should have been tender. 2 parents standing over their sleeping child in the dark, and it was not, because I was already coiled tightly around the thing Carol had said, and he knew it. "She talked to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "She did," I said quietly. "She said the 2 of you had been discussing this, for a while, apparently." He exhaled, a slow, careful breath that told me everything. "We talked about it once, maybe twice. I didn't know she was going to bring it up tonight. I was going to raise it with you myself. I wanted to find the right way to frame it." I turned to look at him. The nursery was dark enough that I could only read his face in outline, but I didn't need full light for that. I knew that face. I knew the particular configuration of guilt and self-justification it wore when he had done something he understood to be wrong, but had spent enough time rationalizing that it no longer felt fully wrong to him. I had seen it other times, a familiar face, a face I had learned to be cautious of. "And what?" I asked. "Were you planning to say to me?" "Just that it might be a kind thing to do. For Diane. You've seen how she is around babies. She really does struggle, Clara. I've watched her leave rooms. I've watched her cry in the car on the way home from things. She's in genuine pain." He looked down at Emma, his voice softening in a way that was clearly meant to appeal to whatever maternal tenderness I still had to spare. I wasn't thinking of it as hiding Emma. I was thinking of it as protecting Diane from something that actively hurts her. "By relocating our daughter," I said, "from her own home. By being flexible occasionally about where Emma is during a 2-hour Sunday visit." The refrigerator downstairs hummed through the ceiling. Emma shifted in her sleep, a small half-word of a sound, and we both held still until she settled again. "When Carol first brought this to you," I said very quietly, "what did you say to her?" The pause was just a fraction too long. "I said I'd talk to you about it." "You didn't say no." He didn't answer immediately. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree again, and the leaves brushed the window in that soft, sibilant whisper. "I thought it was worth considering," he said, before dismissing it outright. "How many times, Daniel?" Not a question, a statement, flat and specific. "How many conversations with your mother about where our daughter should or shouldn't be before you thought to mention any of it to me?" "Clara." "How many evenings did you get off the phone with her and decide tonight wasn't the right night to tell me?" He looked at his hands. He looked at Emma. He looked at a point somewhere past my left shoulder that seemed to require his attention. "A few times," he said. "She's brought it up a few times. I kept saying I'd handle it. I should have told you sooner. I know that. You let her believe you were going to bring me around to this idea," I said. I wasn't raising my voice. I was incapable of raising my voice in that room, in the dark, over our sleeping daughter. But something in my tone must have reached him, because he finally looked at me directly. "She came here tonight thinking the groundwork had been laid. That's why she waited until you were out of the room. She expected me to be softer, more prepared, because you were supposed to have prepared me." He didn't deny it. I went to bed before Carol left. I lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house below. The low murmur of the television, the soft thud of the front door, Daniel's careful footsteps on the stairs. He got into bed without turning on the lamp, the way he did when he thought I might be asleep. I was nowhere near asleep. I lay still with my eyes open in the dark and thought about all the conversations that had taken place about my daughter, about her movements, her presence, her rightful place in her own home, that I had not been party to. And I thought about one thing in particular, a thing that settled into me with a quiet, leaden certainty. Carol had not been surprised that Daniel hadn't spoken to me. She had been surprised by the timing. She had expected him to have done it already. She had structured this entire evening around the assumption that he would have, which meant that somewhere in those few conversations, she had extracted something that functioned like a promise. I did not sleep. I lay still in the dark beside a man I had trusted absolutely, and I began, quietly, to understand that I had been the only person in this house who didn't know what was being planned. In the morning, Daniel made coffee. I heard the grinder from upstairs, that familiar roaring buzz that had been the first sound of every day for 4 years of our marriage. And for a moment, Lying there in the gray stillness, I felt the strange dissociative distance of a woman who has spent the night revising everything she thought she knew. The smell of coffee came up the stairs eventually, rich and dark, and Emma began stirring in the nursery at the same time she always did, talking softly to herself in the private language of babies who haven't yet learned that other people are listening. I lifted her warm, solid weight out of the crib and held her against my chest in the pale morning light, feeling the small, absolute certainty of her. And I made myself a promise, before I even knew I was making it. I was not going to hide her, and I was going to find out exactly how deep this had gone. Daniel was standing at the counter when I came downstairs with Emma on my hip. He had the look of a man who has been waiting for something difficult and is relieved it is finally arriving. He poured my coffee without being asked and stood leaning against the counter, watching me settle Emma into her high chair. The morning light came through the kitchen window in long, pale bars. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. "Tell me everything," I said. "Not the version you were going to frame carefully. The actual version." He sat down and he told me. He told me that Carol had first raised the subject when I was 4 weeks pregnant, framing it then as a temporary measure, just during the pregnancy, just to protect Diane. Then, after Emma was born, she had said maybe just the first few months, then the first year. Each request felt separate. He said each time he had thought, "This is the last one, she'll let it go." He turned his coffee mug in slow circles on the table while he talked, and I noticed that he never once said the words "I should have refused." He said I didn't realize, and I thought it would pass, and I was trying to protect everyone, which is not the same thing. "I need to see the emails," I said. He looked up sharply. "Between you and your mother, about this." I held his gaze. "Because what you're describing isn't a few casual mentions. That's a negotiation, and I wasn't at the table." He brought me his laptop. What I found there was not a handful of awkward exchanges I could be angry about and eventually forgive. It was systematic. It was documented. It stretched back 14 months, beginning when I was 4 weeks pregnant, and had not yet told anyone outside our immediate family. Carol had written the first email the week after our announcement. Thrilled, of course. Deeply thrilled, but wanting to begin thinking practically about Diane's well-being going forward, given what we know about her fragility. She had proposed a set of what she called protocols for managing Diane's exposure to the pregnancy and the child once born. Daniel had written back 3 words. "Sure, Mom, let's talk." Not, "I'll need to discuss this with Clara first." Not, "This isn't something I'm comfortable agreeing to." Just, "Let's talk." I kept scrolling. By my 3rd month, Carol had moved from protocols to specifics. An actual itemized schedule detailing which family events would be Diane present and which would be baby present, as if my child were an allergen to be managed. She had suggested that Daniel take point on family communications to ensure Clara understood the importance of cooperation. Daniel had responded, "I think that could work. She'll come around." My husband, discussing my compliance. 14 months before I knew any of this was happening, I found the worst of it near the bottom of the thread, sent 8 weeks ago. Carol had outlined a timeline for resolution, instructing Daniel to prepare Clara for the new arrangement before the holidays, so the question of Emma's visibility would be settled. And then, in the same email, a single sentence that I read 3 times. "If Clara continues to be resistant, I have spoken with Robert about options." Robert was Carol's family attorney. My hands had stopped trembling. There is a point past shock where the body simply runs out of adrenaline, and what remains is something colder and more functional. I sat very still, and I read every email. Emma had finished her oatmeal and was pushing her bowl around the tray with satisfied purpose. Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway, pale, not with embarrassment, but with the pallor of a man watching something he had buried get dug up. "Did you ask her what she meant by options?" I said. He said nothing, and in his silence I had my answer. I called my father that afternoon, sitting in my car in the driveway with Emma asleep in her car seat behind me and the engine running. My father listened to everything without interrupting. The emails, the protocols, the word options, the phrase "she'll come around." He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said calmly, "Photograph every email before anything gets deleted, and then call Patricia Webb. She's a family law attorney. I've already told her you might be in touch." I absorbed this. "How long have you known something was wrong?" "Carol called me last spring," he said carefully, "to discuss your difficulty adjusting to the responsibilities of expanding a family. I had no proof then. I should have told you. That was possibly a mistake on my part." I sat in the car for a moment after we hung up. Emma breathed softly in the back seat. I thought about Carol calling my father, a man she had met perhaps 12 times, to plant the idea that I was unstable, difficult, a problem that needed managing. She had been constructing this version of me for over a year and quietly circulating it before I had done a single thing to deserve it. I photographed every email. Then I called Patricia. The confrontation happened 4 days later. I requested it. I was specific about who I wanted present. Diane, Carol's younger son Michael and his wife, and Carol's oldest friend Greta, who had known the family for 30 years. Carol agreed with the gracious confidence of a woman who believed she controlled every gathering that took place in her home. She did not control this one. I arrived with the printed emails in a manila folder and Emma in her car seat, which I set directly in the center of Carol's living room. Not to the side, not in another room, in the center, where everyone could see it, where Diane could see it. Emma looked around the room with the cheerful, uncomplicated interest of a 9-month-old, and I watched Diane's face when she saw my daughter. I watched the brief, careful grief move across it, followed by something simpler and more honest, a small, genuine smile. "Thank you all for being here," I said. I stood in the center of the room and kept my voice level. I wanted to have this conversation with everyone present because I think it's important that Carol doesn't have the opportunity to describe what I'm about to say as an emotional overreaction from someone who's difficult to manage. I placed the folder on the coffee table. "I have the emails." Carol looked at the folder with the expression of a woman who has just seen the one thing she was certain would never appear. Diane spoke first. "Carol," she said very quietly, "what is that?" "Private correspondence," Carol said, "that Clara had no business." "It's emails," I said, "planning how to keep Emma invisible at family events so Diane wouldn't be triggered, including a reference to consulting Carol's attorney about options." I looked at Diane directly. "I have never resented you. I have gone out of my way to be kind to you because your grief is real and it deserves kindness. What I will not do is make my daughter disappear in her own family to serve a plan that was designed and executed without my knowledge or consent." Diane looked at her sister. "You told me," she said slowly, "that Clara had agreed to this, that she had asked you to help work out the details." Her voice was gaining something, a quiet, gathering firmness. "She didn't agree, did she?" "She knew nothing about it," I said, "until 4 nights ago." "In what capacity?" Patricia's voice said from my phone on the coffee table. "Were you consulting Robert, Mrs. Harmon? I'm a family law attorney. I've reviewed the correspondence, and I'd be happy to discuss the implications if that's helpful. Carol looked at my phone on her coffee table. For the first time in 4 years, I watched Carol have no response prepared. I turned to Daniel, who was sitting to my left with the look of a man at a sentencing. "You have a choice to make," I said quietly. "Your silence for 14 months was not neutral. It was a vote. I need to know, today, in front of these people, which side of this you're actually on." The room was completely still. Emma was investigating her own toes. Daniel looked at his mother. He looked at me. Then he said, in a rough and unsteady voice that was nevertheless present and unmistakable, "My side is Clara's and Emma's." He looked at Carol. "This ends, Mom." Carol walked down the hallway to her kitchen with her back very straight and did not come back. The months that followed were not simple. Daniel and I went to counseling. Real counseling, the kind where you sit in a small, neutral room and say the true things you have been navigating around for years. He talked about his mother in ways I had never heard him talk before, about the weight of being her eldest son, about learning young that preemptive compliance was the path of least resistance. I listened. I did not absolve him easily because what had happened required more than an apology. It required demonstrated change, day by day, over time. But I watched him make those choices, and slowly, carefully, I began to trust the making of them. Carol did not come to Emma's first birthday party. Diane came with a small stuffed elephant wrapped in paper covered with silver stars. My father came. The kitchen smelled of sugar and coffee and buttercream frosting, and Emma sat in the center of it all, visible, celebrated, entirely and unambiguously present, and destroyed her birthday cake with both hands while everyone laughed. I stood at the kitchen doorway later that afternoon, watching Daniel spin Emma in slow circles, while she shrieked with the unbearable joy of a 1-year-old being spun, and I thought about Carol's word, protocols. I thought about all the careful architecture of a woman who had believed she could determine where my child was allowed to be seen. Some people build their power out of other people's silence. They count on you to keep the peace, to avoid the scene, to decide that the cost of confrontation is higher than the cost of compliance. What they don't account for is the moment you stop calculating the cost, the moment you look at your daughter in her crib in the dark and understand that some things simply are not negotiable. Not for peace, not for family harmony, not for anyone's timeline of resolution. Emma would grow up visible, in every room she chose to be in, on her own terms, on her own schedule, with her face in full light. That was the only protocol that had ever mattered. And now, finally, everyone knew it.